This is a book review of Jon Meacham's biography of Thomas Jefferson. This is an in-depth account, excavation, analysis, study of one of the key founding fathers of the United States, the author of the 1776 Declaration of Independence, as well as the third President of the United States. Jon Meacham studies the personal life of Thomas Jefferson, including some of the less than flattering aspects of his personal affairs, and also his public life, his work as somebody who believed in limited government, very much a vociferous critic of the system of monarchy, which was at the time normal. For example, at this time, the 13 colonies of North America were ruled by George III of Great Britain, and the Whigs, those on the left, very much opposed the rule of Britain over the 13 colonies, particularly on the grounds that at this time there was a big debate and dispute about taxation, and the 13 colonies wanted no taxation without representation, were very much feeling and of the opinion that they were being treated unjustly, unfairly, taxed by someone who, was thousands of miles away in London, and that this way of doing things was not acceptable, and that they wanted more autonomy, more control over their own affairs, and wanted to break free from colonial rule. And Thomas Jefferson was very much influenced by the writings of John Locke. Thomas Jefferson was an erudite, avid reader of books, built his own personal libraries, and was known to be a lover of science and of horticulture and of studying history. And many accounts of Thomas Jefferson include people being highly impressed with his worldly knowledge on a great number of different subjects. He actually wrote that one of his great regrets, or one of the pains of his life, was that in giving up so much of his time to the cause, the American cause of gaining independence, he sacrificed his own love and his own inclination, which would have been more similar to what Benjamin Franklin was able to do in studying more as a scientist and reading and contributing in a more academic way. But nonetheless, Thomas Jefferson was very much an ambitious person, practical, and a very talented writer. One of the reasons why he was chosen to author the 1776 Declaration was because his writing was very impressive and profound. He wrote the famous line, "Men are born with the right to life, liberty, and the pursuits of happiness." So this very much comes from John Locke, who 100 years earlier was writing about natural rights, what Thomas Jefferson called inalienable rights, which includes life, liberty, and property, and that, building on Thomas Hobbes' view of the social contract, humans form governments, allow governments to protect those rights. So in this way of viewing political systems and the way politics should be done is very much of the view that government exists to secure the rights of all individuals, and this is their function, and that if they're not able to do so, or if they encroach upon the rights, that the people have a right to change either the system of government, or in a democratic system, to change representatives. And Thomas Jefferson was very much a Democrat. When the United States gained independence from Great Britain, there was a divide, there was a difference of opinion between himself, Thomas Jefferson, and Hamilton, and perhaps George Washington as well, who Thomas Jefferson was very critical of some of the politicians in the United States at this time in the latter part of the 18th century, because they, it seemed to him, were building too strong a government, a highly centralised, top-down system, and Thomas Jefferson, very much like an architect, and writing out the blueprints, writing out the system, thinking about the system. He was also an architect. He designed his own house. So for him, as an abstract thinker, his conception, his understanding, his ideal structure for how the United States government should be built, the different parts of it, the checks and balances, the different bodies which would represent competing interests. One of the really interesting points about this particular period of history is that it's unique, because at this time, when the colonists, when the founding fathers and the rebels and the Continental Army, when they gained independence, they then had to devise a system of government to rule over the 13 colonies. And of course, each of those colonies had their own local governments. So Thomas Jefferson was a Virginian. He later built his own home, his own house in Virginia, called Monticello. And in reading this book and in reading Thomas Jefferson, one can learn a great deal about politics, because from a political science point of view, we're looking at a time when a new system was being formed, a new system was being created, and the founding fathers very much wanted to avoid what they would consider tyrannical or unjust government, taking the Thomas Paine and John Locke from an earlier period, their view that a system should be democratic, people should have a say, they should have a voice, they should elect representatives who can speak on their behalf, and policies and laws and rules should be made from the bottom up. And there was a divide between people of that mindset and people who were dismissively called Tories, people like Edmund Burke, who criticised the French Revolution, because what had happened was that you had the colonists wanting independence from Great Britain in 1770, and actually the war with Great Britain lasted a long time. The British didn't really leave the United States until around 1820, so it went on for a long time, on and off. But you can clearly see the political divide, the schism between right and left in looking at American independence and the French Revolution. So the French Revolution occurred in Paris in around 1789, and Tories, people in favour of monarchy and aristocracy, it's complicated because what those words mean depend on the context, depend on the country, and specifically on the circumstances and the configuration of the country. So Britain is different from France and Paris. So when Edmund Burke is criticising the French Revolution, he is doing so from a different perspective, a different point of view, and from Thomas Jefferson and Thomas Paine's viewpoint, he is not appreciating the fact that people in Paris were not allowed to have a say in how the city and the country at large was being governed, and that people in power were not paying taxes, they were not contributing, and that taxes were being paid by the poorest in society disproportionately, whilst many of the richest people were living in great big palaces. And so this animated the animosity which led to the French Revolution in 1789. But Thomas Jefferson lived through this entire period, and one can learn a great deal about politics and political science and the political machinery of the state, if you will, and about how all of these institutions developed. By studying the life of someone who was at the centre of it, he went to Paris and wrote letters from Paris back to Virginia and back to Washington, talking about what he saw in Paris and about how the system that Parisians, the majority of Parisians, were living under was unjust and unfair. He was always strongly in favour of the French Revolution because he said that the system needed to change, needed to become more democratic, needed to become more inclusive, to stop people who were permanently at the top from just being there without contributing indefinitely and in such a way as to disallow other people, perhaps with talent and insight and competency, from being able to move up and having some say, having some influence in shaping the affairs of Paris. But taxation is a crucial point that's at the heart of why all of this animosity was generated, both in Paris, this is 1789, and in the United States in 1776. And so this book details this period through the eyes, through the lens of Thomas Jefferson and the thousands of letters he wrote. He was a prolific writer of letters. So we know a lot about Thomas Jefferson because he wrote to so many different people in different countries, and a very important figure. One can also learn about economics, because in learning about political structures and systems, one can learn about systems which give rise to stable economies, because in some parts of the world they suffer from a lack of investment because investors don't have confidence in the political system, in the structures which are going to guarantee the property rights of that country. So people are reluctantly, they're simply not going to invest in a country where they don't know whether or not in 5 or 10 years those investments will be worth anything, because the government might take the assets, they might be confiscated. So all of this comes to bear. All of this is relevant in this very tumultuous, chaotic, fascinating time that Thomas Jefferson lived in, and understanding it can give you a better understanding of politics today, because often on the news they present things as if everything is new, but some of the arguments about taxes and about having a progressive tax system and about world affairs more generally, they go way back in time. So an interesting book, very well written, gives an account of both the man and the president, both the personality, including the negative aspects of his character, the selfish aspects of his character, as well as what he was able to do to build what is today one of the most important countries in the world. He's an important person and he's relevant today, and one can understand a lot about related areas, not least in economics, in law, and of human nature and psychology as well, because this comes into the equation when looking at what happened at the turn of the 18th century, a remarkable, unique, fascinating periods of history. So if you're looking for a book on Thomas Jefferson, this one won an award. It's very detailed, it's very thick, there's a lot in there, and clearly someone who has researched over many decades, I would say, to really understand Thomas Jefferson. There are some great documentaries that you can watch as well. There's a great one by PBS, available on YouTube, quite old now, I think it came out in 1997, but there are some other videos, documentaries on Thomas Jefferson which you can also watch to supplement the reading of this book, but you won't necessarily need it because it's not difficult to picture. What I love about books is the ability to see, to form pictures, to imagine what's going on, and Jon Meacham has done a great job in describing in a way that brings his life to life, to actually enable you to kind of imagine him riding his horse through forest at winter time, or sat there in his study under candlelights with a feather, writing out these documents and all of these letters to George Washington, John Adams, Hamilton, his rival. So all of this is really interesting. Check it out. Thank you very much.